This is Tornado Talk, a weekly podcast about one of nature's most fascinating phenomenons. Share your tornado story online by email or call us toll-free 800-439-1570. That's 800-439-1570. Now, meteorologist Jennifer Naramore and Dan Holliday, Tornado Talk is on.
It's hard to imagine what life was like in 1924. After all, you'd be over 90 years old if that was the year you were born.
2 babies were delivered in 1924 that would go on to be President of the United States.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter. It would also bring us famous actors Marlon Brando, Cicely Tyson, and Don Knotts.
Radio was in its infancy. One of America's first AM radio stations was less than 4 years old.
We'd appreciate it if anyone hearing this broadcast would communicate with us, as we are very anxious to know how far the broadcast is reaching.
So you can imagine on June 28, 1924, when a powerful tornado devastated towns in Ohio, how different it was from today. No sirens, no cell phone alerts. It happened too fast for radio stations to warn what listeners there were then. There was no warning, only word of mouth. Everyone was caught by surprise.
WOIO TV Cleveland meteorologist John Loffman.
Came through downtown Lorain. The estimates are anywhere between 4,000 feet across and 500 feet across. It was deemed an F4.
Betsy Bell, author of the book The 1924 Tornado in Lorain and Sandusky, Deadliest in Ohio History.
The bodies kept coming in for 2 days, and they made a makeshift morgue at the high school, but they also had to make a makeshift morgue on the beach.
This is Tornado Talk, caught by surprise. June 28th, 1924. It is still the most destructive tornado to ever hit the state of Ohio. It's believed that 85 people were killed, 72 in Lorain alone. More than 200 were seriously injured.
Archived weather maps show that a strong low-pressure system was centered over central Nebraska. WOIO TV meteorologist John Loffman, whose website is atmosphereadventures.com, says he studied how the tornado formed that day.
It was a sultry, slightly overcast June afternoon more than 90 years ago. This sultry afternoon was visited by a tornado that had origins well east of us. Now, we're only 50 miles from Canada, so we get some chilly Canadian air come through, even in June. And when that cold Canadian air crosses the relatively warm waters of Lake Erie, we're talking about 72-degree waters, it often spins off water spouts. And these are cousins to the tornado, as you know, and they are a phenomenon that occur in places like the Great Lakes. We have this unique setup with this lake effect snow that we get, one of only 5 places on the planet. And so our topography here is kind of unusual, if not unique. So sultry June afternoon, cold air coming across the lake. This tornado forms.
Betsy Bell may know more about the deadliest tornado in Ohio history than anyone left alive. She's thoroughly researched what happened that day for her book, released on the 90th anniversary of the Twister. It was a family member who was a witness that intrigued her to learn more about what happened.
I had spent my early childhood in Elyria, which is south of Lorain, about 7 miles. And I knew there had been a bad storm in Lorain, but no one ever talked about it. My grandmother suffered from post-traumatic stress. She was terrified of storms, and I found out later that the reason was because she had been a witness to the aftermath of this tornado. But I had never really pursued anything on the subject. I had written 2 books, fiction novels, and until I got to have to spend some time in Elyria with a relative that was ill, and I started haunting libraries and historical societies and doing the things that writers always do when they're bored. And I started reading about the tornado, and I couldn't believe the stories of what occurred to different people and to the town itself. And slowly I felt that I really had to write this book. I felt like these people had to have their stories heard.
It was the 1920s. The world, so different. The President of the United States was Calvin Coolidge.
They take from each home annually an average of over $300, and taxes must be paid.
They were part of the recreation of America after World War I. The country was changing drastically, and yet, in some ways, people were living in the 19th century.
Betsy says that Sandusky, Ohio was quite small and had 7 factories and a railroad hub. Lorain was an up-and-coming industrial center. The city was filled with immigrants, many of whom had never experienced a tornado. Because it was such a hot day, residents made their way to the lake to enjoy the afternoon. C.C. Cooper, the meteorologist in Sandusky hired just 3 weeks earlier, was keeping an eye on the storm system moving in.
Cooper spotted what he thought was a funnel from his office window. At first, he thought the funnel might become a waterspout and stay offshore. But it didn't. The storm increased in intensity and came ashore as a tornado heading right for his office.
But it missed him, and it hit the yacht club instead. It totally destroyed the yacht club, and then proceeded down one of the main streets and headed towards the Ferry depot. Along the way, the tornado killed 7 people.
What was once thought to be a waterspout along the lake was now a killer tornado. It was dinner time when more people were home rather than on the streets. But the nearby ferry was full with 1,000 people on board. Once again, the tornado headed toward them, but passengers followed orders that otherwise might have cost them their lives.
And the captain, very courageously, because all the people on the ferry were watching the tornado coming, told everyone to stay in their seats and not panic. And the tornado came straight for them and suddenly veered at the last minute and went back out to the middle of the lake. And even though there was a strong wake with waves, the ferry was not hit.
WOIO TV meteorologist John Loftman described the unusual track the tornado took next, where it would cause the most damage.
And then moves back out over the lake. It's an eastward path from Sandusky to Lorain. And so there's a chunk of water between the two towns, and the tornado came across that water, hit Lorain about 5:08 to 5:11 in the afternoon. So the daytime heating was already at its near peak. So a lot of diurnal heating, a lot of moisture in the air, plenty of fuel for this thing.
It made a right turn. People said it was just a phenomenal. The funnel just suddenly made a right turn and headed straight for the beach. And the first person that saw it was a lifeguard, and he realized that it wasn't just a storm out on the water, but it was an actual tornado. And he began to use his megaphone to call people to safety. And some people panicked and ran home in their bathing suits, but most of the people ran for the new bathhouse, which was a 2-story bathhouse. And that was a mistake because the tornado made a direct hit on the bathhouse. And the people that were on the first floor, the top floor of the bathhouse, were all just lifted right up and into the lake or crushed in the rubble when they were dropped. Some people on the bottom floor did survive, although many were injured badly because of all the rubble that landed on top of them.
Much like the stories we hear about today, people were just out enjoying their day when all of a sudden disaster struck. After the twister slammed into the bathhouse, it headed for a refreshment stand.
And there a lovely girl named Mary Kuldeja. She was 16, and she was the child of immigrants from Eastern Europe, was working at the refreshment stand. And a boy who went to school with her later said he was talking to her, and the tornado picked up the entire shack with Mary inside and lifted her right out and threw her out into the lake. She came ashore with other people that had drowned, and it was determined she did not die from head injuries. She died from drowning.
Mary had survived being lofted in the air, but the wind-blown waves were too much for her to swim out of.
Eleanor Meredith was a Pennsylvania resident, but came back to Lorain, Ohio to visit family. She decided to head for the beach of Lake Erie that afternoon with her brother Harry and his son William.
And when the tornado started coming, they ran for the bathhouse. And Harry ran down to the lower level, and Eleanor and William were on the top level. So after the storm hit and passed, Harry crawled out of the rubble and found the body of his sister. He did not know that his son had also died. But covered completely with debris, people said he looked like a ghost because the impact of the storm, the stones from the concrete just embedded in people, so that the survivors looked like they had been dipped in white plaster. Poor Harry ran all the way home to his parents' house, only to find his parents standing in the middle of the lawn. They were fine, but the house had been picked up and carried away. Harry collapsed, and he later died that night. His lungs had exploded from the breathing in all the debris and by trying to run all the way to his parents' house. And the death certificate said that destruction of the lungs. That family that had three people die before sunset of that day.
It was a Saturday on June 28, 1924. In that era, people often worked half-days on Saturday so they could shop during the afternoon. Lorain was busy. Stores were bustling. Automobiles were a luxury and were lined along the streets by those who could afford them. While many knew it might rain, no one had a forecast or even a warning as to what would happen next.
The tornado proceeded into town. The movie theater, the State Theater, was the best movie theater in Lorain, and that theater was had a big a special show, a silent film that day, and they had over 1,000 people in the theater, most of them children. At about 4:30, the manager of the theater looked out and saw it was going to rain, and saw that there were other kids lining up for the afternoon, the late feature. So he hurried the people out of the theater, the 1,000 people, and started bringing in the children, mostly teenagers, that were going to see the later show. He hurried them in, and he told his pianist, Mary Hirsch, who played the music that followed the silent film, that he was bringing people in early because it looked like it was going to rain. He didn't realize that a tornado was heading his way. And the tornado hit Main Street, flung cars everywhere. People found cars on top of roofs, people actually in the cars as they were being lifted up and then being dropped 4 stories. But what happened with the State Theater was that it was next door to the Wickens Furniture Store, and the Wickens Furniture Store was 8 stories high, and the State Theater was 4 stories high. And the State Theater had a theater on the first floor, and then the next 3 levels were all apartments that looked out over the lake. So when the tornado hit the Wickens Furniture Store, the 8-story building, it picked up the roof, which was very heavy with beams and steel, picked everything up and dropped everything on the State Theater. The State Theater's roof began to crumble, and Mary Hirsch was at her piano playing the song Sacrifice and wondering why she was hearing a rumbling sound and why the walls were starting to buckle, when it suddenly dawned on everyone in the theater, and there were about 250 people at that point, that the theater was collapsing, and each floor buckled like an accordion, one on top of the other. So Mary Hirsch did escape. She jumped out of the orchestra pit and raced out of the theater. But the children that were sitting under the balcony, they were the ones that were plunged into the basement. One man who was at the theater raced into the lobby and didn't know which way to turn, and he saw a poster, he testified later, that said, "Last Chance," and he raced towards the poster, and he survived. Another man raced into the theater later to save his daughters, and he grabbed 2 girls covered in dust, raced out of the theater, and was a block away when he realized that he didn't know who the 2 children were he had saved. They weren't his daughters. But he found out later that his 2 daughters had crawled out of the theater. They were okay. So the people that made it to the lobby, for the most part, were severely injured, some of them, but most of them did survive. There were 15 deaths ultimately at the State Theater. All but 1 were children or teenagers.
Betsy Bell, author of the book, The 1924 Tornado in Lorain and Sandusky, Deadliest in Ohio History, tells us the tornado turned out to the water, then went along the shoreline. From there, it went into the countryside, hitting 3 different barns on 3 different farms where workers were milking cows. In each location, the farmer and the cows were killed. The tornado's path was finally about to end.
And eventually it just dissipated, and they found papers and paraphernalia as far east as Erie, Pennsylvania. And a lot of the people along the shoreline said that from Cleveland to Erie, Pennsylvania, there were a lot of debris floated ashore in the coming days.
Meteorologist John Loftman said that while the Fujita scale was far from being established, it later would be rated EF4 damage in Lorain.
The city of Lorain had very few buildings that were of steel construction. The Antlers Hotel was the only one really, and that only had minimal damage. But all this wood-constructed homes and businesses, many of them were just completely demolished, just wiped completely away. If you saw the pictures, cars and trucks overturned. This was just a phenomenal thing that occurred right in the middle of town.
The town of Lorain was in shambles. No power, no phones, no telegraph. Most of the local doctors had gone to a convention in Germany. Only a few stayed back and were available to assist with the hundreds of injuries. Somehow, the word needed to spread that the people of Lorain were in dire need.
They couldn't send boats because the Black River that flows into Lake Erie and where the shipyards were was just a whirlpool because of the winds and the debris, and there wasn't any way to get out. And so they decided they would get the bicycle boys that used to take letters around, and they got as many boys with bicycles as they could. And they told them they had to go to neighboring communities and tell them what happened. And some of the bicycle boys had written down what they had seen before they left, the total destruction in Lorain proper, and also out at Lakeview Beach Park, the cars bobbing in the lakes, with the boys going out all over to farms, and mostly little farming communities. They didn't have suburbs like we think of suburbs. You had your industrial community, and then almost immediately you would go out and you would see farmland. So they had to get the word out that way. And then, of course, they sent people for the long run to Cleveland, which really, in modern terms, wasn't that far, but it was just the difficulty of getting there, especially since all the roads were completely jammed with trees and debris. It wasn't possible to send any cars out. So it was the bicycle boys spread the word.
Betsy said the stories from her grandmother were filled with details about the devastation as she and her family made their way into Lorain to look for a relative.
You could hear the screams of the people trapped in the houses, moaning and calling for help. Night was falling and there wasn't any light. People were walking with lanterns, calling for beloved ones. They had walked by the lake and they could see the cars out on the lake. It was very hard for them to even find the street where my great-aunt lived, but they did find her eventually. That it was 1924, and zoning laws were not like they are today, and so people in the city frequently kept chickens and goats, lambs, turkeys. Some people even had horses in their garage/barn, and those animals, for the most part, a lot of them survived the storm. So, along with the people, people said there were chickens flying by and animals going through the injured and lost, and it just added to this scene of total chaos.
It's believed approximately 85 died, but many others went missing. A tornado that took twists and turns that still ranks as Ohio's worst. One of the lives lost was a lady named Gertrude. It might be one of the most unusual stories of that fateful day.
Gertrude Mills ran the feed shop with her husband. They had the biggest feed shop in Lorain, and it was down near the industrial area. She worked hard, very hard. They were German immigrants and English. And her husband wanted a day off, and he decided he was going to go out on the lake. And so Gertrude said she'd run the feed shop, and it was a direct hit by the tornado. And when her husband finally managed to make it back to Lorain, he had a great difficulty getting his boat in. He and his son and other people came, and it was flattened. And they kept digging for Gertrude, and it took them 2 days to find her. And the way they had almost given up, and she was dead. But they heard little chicks chirping, and it turned out that a crate of chicks that had been brought into the feed shop had survived, and they were right near Gertrude. And so when they went for the chicks, they found Gertrude's body, and she had been killed in the storm. But they were very relieved that they had found her and they could give her a proper burial.
It is hard to imagine having no warning with the technology that we have today. WOIO TV meteorologist John Loftman uses the medium of television to warn his viewers of severe weather, a means of communication that didn't exist back then. How did any warning get out about this tornado?
What I've heard is word of mouth. There really was no communication as this thing just came across the lake. And of course, had it had a history of reaching someplace like immediately to the west was the town of Sandusky, west of Lorain, that is. And, if somebody had gotten on the phone and said, hey, there's a storm coming your way, maybe somebody would have had a heads up. But to our knowledge, there just was not any kind of early alert system. And so no one knew about this. You're swimming on the beach 1 minute, you're walking down the street, and the next minute it's pouring rain, the sky turns black, and there's a roar that overpowered the thunder. The accounts just simply said the thunder stopped and we could no longer hear it because of the roar of the tornado as it came through the town. This was a caught by surprise kind of an event.
Next on Tornado Talk, the motion picture Twister hit the big screen in 1996, sending storm chasers spinning into action. Now, a new movie begins filming this summer from a collection of worldwide talent. Release date, May 10th, 2017. Twisters, the fan-made sequel, director, cast, and crew on Tornado Talk.
This has been Tornado Talk, powered by thestormreport.com.